I think, first of all, when it comes to Israel, the Middle East is changing really fast. And how China and the U.S. respond to these shifts is going to obviously shape the region's future. But China's influence is clearly growing, and it's not clear as to whether they're going to fully replace the U.S. as dominant power. But they're definitely playing a long game. And I think it's really important to analyze that the polling data does show a clear shift. People in the Middle East are favoring China's approach over the U.S.
Well, it is in one sense. Then that Arab Barometer poll that you're referencing there, into that favored Xi Jinping over Joe Biden. Arab Barometer researchers were also quick to note when they asked any follow-up question to respondents, they didn't know anything about China for the most part. Their China literacy was very low. It was more of, we don't like the U.S., so we like China. But it wasn't very deep in terms of their understanding of why do they like China.
Again, can China play a political role in the region? I think it could. But if it really wanted to do that, I think it needs to move away from this kind of lip service, heavy rhetoric kind of phase into an actual action, very much more pragmatic stage in its diplomacy.
Allie, how effective do you think the Chinese have been in terms of undermining U.S. credibility in Israel and in the region more broadly?
So I actually think they've been very, very effective. I think China's response to October 7th and its aftermath was extremely telling and very, very impactful.
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. Today we're going to head back to the Middle East to discuss China's growing influence in the region. Now, tensions are especially high in the Mideast these days as everyone's nervously waiting for Iran's response to Israel's assassination of a Hamas chief, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran on July 31st. While a lot of the focus over the past couple of weeks has been on the shuttle diplomacy by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, it's also important to note that China, too, is working behind the scenes. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke by phone with Iran's acting foreign minister, Ali Bagheri Kani, and reaffirmed Tehran's right to defend its, quote, and I'm quoting him here now, sovereignty, security, and national dignity. Those are Wang Yi's words. A lot of people interpreted those comments as an endorsement of Iran's right to retaliate against Israel, which of course still has not happened as of the time of this recording, but is causing quite a bit of anxiety nonetheless. Then, a couple of days later at the United Nations, China's Ambassador Fu Kong issued a blistering statement in response to an Israeli missile attack on a school in Gaza City that killed at least 100 civilians. Fu denounced the Israelis and also called on the United States to leverage its strong relationship with Israel to take what he said are, quote, sincere and responsible actions to get Israel to halt military operations in Gaza. Now, for those of you who've been following this issue over the past year, you might find it a bit ironic that the Chinese are calling on the Americans to rein in Israel, because that's exactly what the United States has been asking China to do with the Iranians for more than at least a year, and to get the Iranians to use their leverage with the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas to back down as well, all to pretty much no effect. It seems that both the U.S. and China think that the other side is willing to do this kind of thing when there's absolutely no evidence to support that assertion. And then back in July, if you recall, the Chinese pulled off a pretty impressive feat when they managed to invite senior representatives of 14 Palestinian factions to come to Beijing and agree to something called the Beijing Declaration that aims to mend the bitter divisions among the various Palestinian groups, especially Fatah, that governs the West Bank, and the Islamic militant group Hamas that rules Gaza and was responsible for the October 7th terrorist attack on southern Israel. Although everybody smiled for the cameras and presented a unified front to the world, a lot of people are skeptical that 3 days of diplomacy in Beijing is going to be enough to patch over years of mistrust and divisions among Palestinian factions. But what it does show is that the Chinese government is undeniably playing a much more important role in Mideast diplomacy than it ever has. And this is a very important trend. Over the past year, we've been trying to cover this story from all sides, and today we're going to discuss it from an Israeli perspective. A new article came out last month entitled China's Growing Influence in the Middle East, published by the Australian Security Policy Institute, that delves into this very thorny issue. And I'm thrilled to have the two authors with me today. Gedaliah Afterman is the head of the Asia-Israel Policy Program at the Abba Eban Institute for Diplomacy and Foreign Relations and a lecturer at Reichman University in Herzliya, Israel. And also Allie Weinberger, who worked with Gedaliah on the article as a research assistant, also joins us on the line from Herzliya as well. Gedaliah, great to have you back on the show again. And Allie, welcome for the first time. It's wonderful to speak with you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Gedaliah, let's get started with you. Before we get into the article, I'd like to get your reflections on where we are right now as you see this. You are among the most experienced observers of China's diplomacy in the Middle East. You're obviously sitting in Israel today. What do you see when it comes to Chinese diplomacy in the region and the various maneuverings that have been going on in relation to the Iranians, the Palestinians, and the UN?
Thanks, Eric. So maybe just to recap a little bit what we've seen since the 7th of October in terms of Chinese engagement in the region. Basically, what we've been observing is that China has become more active in the Middle East since the 7th of October. It has this mix of, on the one hand, being quite subdued, quite passive, but on the other hand, being very vocal. We've seen China become quite critical of the United States, quite critical of Israel in the UN, in the UN Security Council, in other platforms. We've seen these discussions behind the scenes with the Iranians and with the Houthis, but as you mentioned earlier, not very effective ones. I think that most recently we've seen that on the one hand, China has become better positioned in terms of public relations in the region. So the region agrees with China's criticism of the United States mainly and of Israel over the Gaza war. But on the other hand, it's interesting to see that the region doesn't take China very seriously as a political player. So when countries in the region think about how do we get out of the situation, how do we solve the situation, they don't necessarily think of China as the power that will solve things. And despite being very critical of the US, they still think that Washington is the relevant power in that sense. You mentioned the discussions with the Palestinians, the Palestinian reconciliation talks in Beijing. I think that has to do with Beijing's attempt to carve a more active role for itself in the conflict. And I think that's something that we can discuss maybe in more detail a bit later on.
Yeah, we definitely want to dive into that. Allie, I'd like to get your take on some of these issues. What are your reflections as you study this?
So I think first I would come at it as an American. I think as an American living in the Middle East, I've seen firsthand how China's stepping in where the US is kind of pulled back. And while America's kind of focusing more on security in the Middle East, China's more in the realm of economic investments and the strategic vision. So that ends up resonating more with countries in the Middle East. So people appreciate that China, here at least, that China isn't imposing as many political conditions that the US is. So it's become a more appealing partner. And then what happens is that it's kind of unsettling, at least for me as an American, to see how quickly China's filling these gaps that are left by the US. And I think if I were still living in America, I might barely notice that shift. And I think many Americans aren't seeing the progress of what China is doing, and because it might be happening more quietly on their side of the world. But in this region, at least, I think we're really at this critical point where these superpowers have positioned themselves in the region in such a strategic way.
What are some of those gaps that you mentioned that Americans may not be aware of, but that the Chinese are filling and that Mideast partners are recognizing?
I think I would go under first, like oil, let's say. So the United States has definitely stepped back from relying on Middle Eastern oil, and China took that and saw it as an opportunity. So they're filling the gap by buying oil and investing heavily in infrastructure within the region. And so while America's focus has shifted, China is becoming more relevant economically.
So Gedaliah, Allie's kind of laid out how this issue is not simply between China and the Mideast, but the United States plays an important role in this, and that the gaps left by the United States, both diplomatically, economically, militarily, in any number of different ways, China is either seeking to fill or leveraging. How does the United States factor into China's thinking on its diplomacy in the region?
So I think the right way or useful way to look at this is to understand that when China looks at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in general and at the Gaza war specifically, it's not really interested, it doesn't really care that much about the Palestinians or the Israelis. It's much more interested in its own position in the region and its own position vis-a-vis the United States. And when we look at the way China has been behaving since the 7th of October, I think one of its main calculations has been how it can use the situation to counter and discredit the U.S. in the region. And we've seen China position itself as, a peace-seeking, moderate power, countering the warmongering United States that supports Israel, that supports, violence against the Palestinians. So I think that has been very much and still is very much part of the calculation in Beijing. I think another aspect, you mentioned again this issue of the U.S. asking China to work with the Iranians or moderate Houthi behavior, etc. I think that there's an interesting calculation shift there in the Beijing, kind of in the Chinese thinking, where in the past we always used to say that China is interested in regional stability, and that's the most important thing from a Chinese perspective for economic and other reasons. And I think we've seen a new kind of tweak in that equation now where if there is instability that impacts the U.S. more than it impacts China, then that's something that the Chinese can live with as well. So we've seen China manage the situation and tweaking their behavior a bit over the last year in a way that maximizes their own position and creates as much damage as possible to the American position in the region.
Allie, how effective do you think the Chinese have been in terms of undermining U.S. credibility in Israel and in the region more broadly?
So I actually think they've been very, very effective. I think China's response to October 7th and its aftermath was extremely telling and very, very impactful. That they started off as neutral and they eventually started to lean more towards the Palestinians and thus criticized the U.S. by siding with these Arab and Muslim perspectives. So this strained their relationship with Israel, but it fits into China's broader goal of positioning itself as this leader for the region. So let's say you look at in February, China represented at the International Court of Justice, created this representation that asserted that Palestinians' right to self-determination included the use of armed struggle and basically explicitly supported Hamas. And let's say you look at later the Palestinian unity talks. They've been very effective and not necessarily being so adamant about what progress is going to be made. Like, let's say you're analyzing the Palestinian unity talks. It's not a question as to whether they're effective or going to be effective in the long run, but rather they're all about competing with the U.S. It's a strategic move to undermine the U.S.'s influence.
Gedaliah, Allie's laid that out pretty clearly, but let's kind of do some scenario planning here and kind of put ourselves in the situation room in Beijing, if there is such a thing. I don't know if they have something like that, but where Xi Jinping gets his top advisors around and they make the calculation that taking the side of the Palestinians and the Muslim majority countries around the world is good politics. Forget about the details of it, but when you look at the public opinion on the war in Gaza, in Africa, in Asia, around the world, even in the United States, in big, large factions of it, the public is definitely not with the Israelis. The Israelis are going to be increasingly isolated in the post-war era. But they're going to need China economically. They're going to need Chinese imports. They're going to need access to the Chinese market. So when this is all over, eventually, as it one day will come to an end, hopefully sooner than later, the Chinese will still have that strong economic relationship, suffered some political damage with Israel, but they will have gained enormously in terms of their stature and credibility in the Middle East and throughout the global South. Do you think that's the calculation that they're making?
So first of all, Eric, I think that if there is this kind of situation in Beijing, then the equation is this mix of strategic planning, but also seizing opportunities. And I think we've seen that play out quite clearly over the last year. And we've seen kind of tweaking as we went along over the last year. Regarding Israel, yes, I think generally speaking, that's the calculation. I think China understood over the last year or so, and even before that, even in the last round with Hamas in 2021, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict could be more useful for it strategically as an instrument or as a stick to discredit the United States, even if it causes some damage in the bilateral relationship with Israel. Now, I think that we've seen that play out pretty clearly over the last 10 months or so. I think we are seeing now a kind of slight correction both on the Israeli and the Chinese side. On Israel, the Chinese position was met with a lot of emotion, with a lot of anger. Some people were kind of calling for burning the bridges with China, and China seemed to be very indifferent to the Israeli position. And I think now both sides are becoming a little bit less emotional, trying to be more pragmatic about it. And in that sense, I think that the Chinese calculation was probably correct. So even though China has taken a very one-sided approach towards the conflict and very critical of Israel, I think the relationship with Israel is generally still intact, especially economically. I think politically, China, as you said, has gained a lot of credit in the region. And I think for Israel, it creates a bit of a complicated picture, a complicated scenario, because Israel will meet China not only in Tel Aviv, but much more so in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh looking forward. And that will be a much more difficult situation to manage.
Why do you think it was that so many Israelis were surprised by China's reaction, disappointed, angered, and just in disbelief that they couldn't understand the Israeli point of view, that Israel was the victim of this horrific attack and that the revenge and the retribution that they're taking is justified? And there was this dismay. Why is it that you think there was that disconnect early on after October 7th?
Well, traditionally, I think it's good to remember that Israelis and Chinese people felt this kind of sense of affinity, culturally at least, as a way of background. And that was also my own experience in my time in Beijing. And a lot of people don't remember this, but later in October 2023, a few weeks after the Hamas attacks, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was due in Beijing for a state visit, right? He was meant to lead with his counterpart, the Joint Committee on Innovation Cooperation. So Israel and China had this high-level prime minister-level dialogue on innovation, right, which was very strategic, and Netanyahu was meant to be back in Beijing to lead that. And I don't know, again, if people remember, but one of the issues that was kind of vaguely in the background was not only bilateral, but also regional. There was a sense, at least in Israel then, that China could perhaps even mediate between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And if it couldn't mediate itself, at least this kind of talk between Netanyahu and his counterparts in Beijing could encourage the U.S. to push forward this regional track. So on the 6th of October, Israel-China relations were becoming a little bit more tense because of American pressure, but were still very positive. So I think that contrast between the two, between this kind of still positive sentiment and the very one-sided, very negative Chinese response from an Israeli perspective, were quite shocking to people. But if you follow the relationship and if you follow China, and especially China-US dynamic in the region, you shouldn't have been surprised, I think, by this.
Allie, what's your take on that? When you're in Israel, especially as an American, where there's very few people in the American national security community that have anything nice to say about China, certainly in Israel, I would imagine it's probably something similar. What's your sense of the sentiment that's there today?
I think, first of all, when it comes to Israel, the Middle East is changing really fast. And how China and the U.S. respond to these shifts is going to obviously shape the region's future. But China's influence is clearly growing, and it's not clear as to whether they're going to fully replace the U.S. as this dominant power. But they're definitely playing a long game. And I think it's really important to analyze that the polling data does show a clear shift. People in the Middle East are favoring China's approach over the U.S. And the Chinese president is seen more favorably than the U.S. president. And it's just, again, highlighting how the Chinese narrative is resonating more with the public here. Obviously, that public is excluding Israel because they have blatantly shown their pro-Palestinian approach. But as in regard to the rest of the Middle East, China is succeeding.
Well, it is in one sense. Then that Arab Barometer poll that you're referencing there, into that favored Xi Jinping over Joe Biden, Arab Barometer researchers were also quick to note when they asked any follow-up question to respondents, they didn't know anything about China for the most part. Their China literacy was very low. It was more of, we don't like the U.S., so we like China. But it wasn't very deep in terms of their understanding of why do they like China. I think that's kind of an important detail. But it is just more, as you pointed out, a disillusionment with the U.S. Let's focus on these Palestinian talks. And this is something that you wrote about in the article, and it's something that's very interesting to get your point of view. I want to read two Chinese perspectives for you on this. Professor Fan Hongda from the Shanghai International Studies University. Professor Fan is one of the most well-known China Mideast scholars, and he writes regularly about this. He was interviewed in the South China Morning Post, and he said, frankly speaking, China-Israel's honeymoon phase is long gone. If China wishes to contribute to the resolution of the Palestinian issue, it must cooperate with Israel. Without Israel's endorsement, any effort to resolve the Palestinian issue would be futile. And I thought that was a level of bluntness that we don't hear from Chinese scholars. I also want to bring a perspective to you from Wang Huiyao, who is the head of the China Center for Globalization. He, too, was writing in the South China Morning Post. China's deep economic ties with these Middle Eastern powers provided both the means and the motivation to push for their reconciliation. As Israel's third largest trading partner, and with bilateral trade volume reaching $14.5 billion last year, China can also, I have reason to believe, play a significant role in promoting a peaceful resolution to the Gaza crisis, potentially offering a path to dialogue where traditional diplomacy has failed. By the way, the words traditional diplomacy are code for the United States. Gedaliah, what is your take on Professor Fan and Wang Huiyao's take on the Palestinian conference, but also the war in Gaza more broadly?
So I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think we've seen a shift in the Chinese strategy or the Chinese perspective on the war. While initially China was very much focusing on discrediting the US and, making these a lot of statements, but not doing much, I think they kind of realized that this is not getting them enough credit. Like you mentioned, the credit that they're getting is rather superficial, but countries in the region do not see China as a real political player when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that is why I think one of the reasons why China initiated or pushed forward these talks between the Palestinian factions. As Ali said earlier, I think that the reasoning behind the talks is China's position in the region more than the talks themselves or more than the result of the talks themselves. But I think I agree very much that if China sincerely or genuinely wants to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it has to involve the Israelis. I think what they were trying to do initially, at least, was to, bypass Israel and the US when it comes to the conflict, to carve a way into the negotiating table, if you like, on the Arab side, on the Palestinian side, without having to deal with Israel and the United States. Whether or not that's been successful is another question. We can talk about that a little bit more as well. Again, can China play a political role in the region? I think it could, but if it really wanted to do that, I think it needs to move away from this kind of lip service, heavy rhetoric kind of phase into an actual action, very much more pragmatic stage in its diplomacy.
What does actual action mean? How does that translate into practice?
I think it's a matter of having skin in the game, if you like, of taking risks, of putting its prestige on the table. At the moment, as we said, China has been talking a lot, but not doing much. Even on the Palestinian talks front, we saw that there were talks, but we saw that the declaration itself wasn't released to the public. We're not sure what the next steps are, right? So how active will China be in this process on the Palestinian side? Is China going to play a role in the day after in the reconstruction of Gaza, for example? Does China have a regional vision for the region? Can China, as you mentioned in your introduction, can China cooperate with the US in calming tensions in the region? I think actual moves in that direction would be more pragmatic, more practical in terms of Chinese involvement politically in the region.
Allie, it's hard to see that the Chinese and the United States would ever cooperate together, given the current tensions between those two countries. But it does seem that the Chinese are looking for spaces in the Middle East where the United States can't operate. So between Saudi and Arabia, the March 2023 reconciliation that was signed in Beijing, that détente that occurred there, that's a space that the U.S. couldn't do because it doesn't have relations with Iran. The Palestinian faction's another area where the U.S. can't operate. Do you see the Chinese moving out of those spaces where the U.S. can't operate and into more collaborative spaces? Or are the Chinese, as Gedaliah is kind of saying, going to stay in this more restricted zone, which is safer, there's less risk, but at the same time, the impact may be more limited?
I happen to agree with Gedaliah. I think that China wants to be a mediator for the Middle East, and I think its ability to do that is by pushing the US out as much as they possibly can. It is a safer space. I think they're able to accomplish a lot more. I think they're able to forge international relations that the US has not been able to, just based on its traditional Western values versus China's kind of ignoring of those values and rather arguing against them. And I think that China is making a lot of progress in that area. I don't see why they would ever decide to collaborate with the US when the US is kind of its main enemy.
In Gedaliah, you guys both said that the war in Ukraine also has an impact on this story. You said it's another factor influencing China's approach. What's the connection to China with the war in Ukraine and the crisis in Gaza?
Well, I think the connection has a few different elements to it. First, for me at least, it was very telling to see that none of the U.S. allies or partners in the Middle East took the American or the Ukrainian side when the war in Ukraine broke out. And that was kind of a telling, a red light to me about the superpower kind of dynamic in the region at the time. So that was one thing. The other is that I think that when China thinks about the mediation of the Palestinian factions, it's part of positioning itself as a mediator globally, right? So if China is seen as a positive actor, a positive mediator in the Palestinian conflict, that kind of positions itself better for possibly mediating in the Ukraine war. So I think this is also an issue of image management on a broader sense as well.
Allie, what's your take on that?
I think that it just makes sense. If you're thinking about why would China be involved in this war, or what's its positioning, is America is on the side of the Ukrainians for the most part, and so is Israel. And therefore, to negate that and further strengthen its political standing with other countries and forge better international relations, like let's say amongst Russia or amongst these Arab countries that have made statements to be pro-Putin, it makes sense for them to be more on that page and align more with the Russian perspective as opposed to the Ukrainian.
I would also add, Eric, that an American failure in the Middle East also impacts the power projection in Ukraine and possibly in the Indo-Pacific as well. And that's something to keep in mind. So if the U.S. is seen to be failing with the Gaza war, with the Iranians, with the Houthis, that weakens it when it comes to other theaters globally. And that's something that I think the Chinese would encourage to an extent.
Well, that's been a criticism of some of the China hawks in Washington, that just recently a U.S. carrier strike group was redeployed from Asia to the Middle East. And that is something that plays to the Chinese, interest as well. Keeping the American military occupied in the Middle East, it is better for them than having them here in the South China Sea in those areas.
I would even take it a step forward in the sense that if the Americans are intervening militarily here in the Middle East and are failing, what does that mean, A, for other theaters? B, what does that mean for America's position as a security guarantor here in the Middle East? So I think that's quite an important element of Chinese thinking.
Yeah, that does make sense. Does the American election have any impact on how the Chinese will engage in their Mideast diplomacy? It was always thought up until about a month ago that the Trump administration was going to come back for a second round. Now we don't know as much. It's a very tight race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. The gap is closed, so we don't know who's actually going to be president. Allie, do you think that's going to make a difference in the Chinese calculation in the fall?
I think it definitely will. I think depending on where China feels it can make more headway between Kamala and Trump is a huge, huge factor. As in, if China thinks that Kamala might be more willing to compromise on Western values versus Trump, which in my opinion, I don't think he would, I think it will make a difference on their stance on the U.S. and whether they're willing to facilitate international relations between the country or not.
Gedaliah, we are now about 7-8 weeks coming up on the anniversary of October 7th, the first anniversary. This is going to go into its second year. There's no indication that there's going to be any resolution to the crisis before October 7th. When we think of what the Chinese are doing in the broader Mideast and the diplomacy that you wrote about in the article, let's look into the second year. What should people be focused on? What do you think will happen in the second year of this crisis with regards to the Chinese?
Oh, that's a good question, Eric. Here in Israel, it's difficult to think, more than a week or two ahead. But I'll do my...
That's right. I'm asking a lot of you, I realize.
Exactly, but I'll do my best. I think this trend of China becoming more active is something that we'll see more of. I think China wants to assert itself at least as a potentially more active political player in the region. I think there is a sense here in the region that maybe the war will be hopefully coming to an end soon. And in that sense, China wants to be ready to make the most of it. I think we could see China potentially playing a role in the day after in Gaza reconstruction and in other ways in the region. The question for me is whether or not that will be done with Israel or without Israel. So given, for example, the fact that China hosted the Palestinian talks, they could potentially do reconstruction projects in Gaza without the Israelis. But as Van Ronda said, it will be smarter, it will be more strategic to do it with the Israelis, and it will be also a better way for China to position itself. I think that once the war is over, we will see a return back to the more regional perspective, the regional talk. The U.S. still wants to push a regional track with Saudi Arabia and others. We have IMEC, right, the India Middle East Economic Corridor that the Americans initiated. If Kamala wins, I think we will see a continuation of that American policy, and that will also have ramifications for the Chinese. I think the Chinese will also try to be more active. If Trump wins, it's a different question, very unpredictable. But I guess, as Ali said, I think the Chinese will always seek opportunities to fill in vacuums where they can. What I think was interesting to see is that the return of the China-Iran relationship over the last year or so, but I think that we will see the Chinese moving back more towards Saudi, UAE as well in the second year of the war.
But we've also heard some strains in that China-Iran relationship over the past 6 to 9 months, some frustration on the Iranian part about the lack of Chinese economic engagement in Iran, the unfulfilled promises of that big $400 billion, whatever, I don't know, it was an MOU, a pact, a deal, whatever it was, a promise. Some people called it a fantasy. And, the fact that Chinese companies are afraid of being sanctioned by the U.S., so they've kept their distance from Iran. But it doesn't seem to have hurt the political relationship, if not.
But just one point of that, we need to kind of differentiate between the two. I think strategically speaking, China sees the relationship with the Saudis, with the Emiratis as more important than the Iranians. But politically, especially when playing the superpower competition game with the U.S., it's been useful over the last year or so. But keep in mind, Eric, that, for example, over the last few weeks, we've seen the Russians play an active or at least a visible military role with the Iranians, but we haven't seen the Chinese do the same. So there's a difference there as well.
Ali, you guys concluded your article looking at China's strategic maneuvers in the Middle East and said over the long term, the impact remains uncertain. Why?
I think China has so many ways to play its game. I think that, as Gedaliah had said before, China has the opportunity to keep taking its neutral stance and becoming more and more and more progressive in the region, and serve more as a mediator, host more talks like the Palestinian Unity talks, or be more a part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think with that power and that mediating potential it has, there's so many ways in which it could go. I think if China decides to facilitate better relations with Israel, which it's clearly put a strain on since October 7th, it could make more progress in the region by creating more unity and cohesion and rebuilding Gaza in whatever capacity that means. And I also think if it decides to continue to be more pro-Arab, Muslim, and kind of ignore the Israeli side, it also has huge ramifications. I think it would really just strengthen its relations with all of these Arab countries and just make headway in a different area. So I think there's just so many ways in which China could go.
Well, let's leave the conversation. There's obviously so much more to talk about. This is, again, a hall of mirrors that no matter where you look, you're always going to see 20 different sides. But we do appreciate you, Gedaliah Afterman and Allie Weinberger from the Abba Eban Institute for Diplomacy and Foreign Relations and Reichman University in Herzliya for joining us. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your insights. The article is China's Growing Influence in the Middle East. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. Gedaliah, Ali, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric.
And I'll be back again next week with Cobus for another edition of the China Global South podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.